All right, music fans, welcome back. Harmless Dave here, trying to talk about real music and trying to do this in real time for a few real people out here, just like you and me here. So, Ross Valory has been out there chatting it up with various outlets, and he said something kind of interesting. And, this is narrative building. After you get booted from a rock band, even the headline kind of spins what happened like he just left the band. No, he was terminated. Anyway, I'm going to talk about that. Before I get there, though, I showcased this album a while back, A Never Ending John's Dream. And the album is called Coming Back to Paradise. I don't know when this came out. I would say February of this year. And here we are in October. But it's a contender for out of nowhere prog rock album of the year, at least for me. I'm sure if you're a prog rock expert, this isn't in your wheelhouse, maybe because you're into some other things. But I really enjoyed this album. And if you like bands like Asia and Rush and Saga, you might enjoy A Never Ending John's Dream. All right, so on to this Ross Valory story. He had a new album too, and they don't even make mention of the new album in his latest interview, or maybe he's done more than one here as far as the interview goes. But he says this when people ask him questions about what went wrong with Journey. And he says, well, the better question is, what went right? And he talks about, hey, they're still going strong and I wish them well and so forth. So when you make a deal, which obviously Ross Valory did prior to that deal, it appeared that he, Steve Smith, initially Jonathan Cain, and then Jonathan Cain switched teams and went over to Team Sean again. And also allegedly, but hard to prove, that Steve Perry was in on this coup as well. If you ask Neil Sean, he'll say, yeah, Steve Perry was on the phone call when these guys were in the room trying to wrestle control of Journey away from Neil Sean. So, do I think that's a very strong possibility? Yep, I do. I don't know why Perry would come back in at this stage. And maybe he does care about what's going on with Journey. A lot of times, when something happens like that thing with Arnell recently, people say, hey, wonder what Steve Perry would think. And I'm sure he has an opinion. But he stays secluded. He doesn't post anything, and good for him. I'm sure he's enjoying his life more than the rest of us. So anyway, so he only talks to Steve Smith these days. The other guy who is officially involved in the coup was Smith and Valory, with maybe help from Jonathan Cain initially, and then possibly Steve Perry. Valory, who tried to open up about his current relationships with various outlets, has stated, I haven't been in touch with anybody except maybe Steve Smith once in a while. And everybody's moved on with their lives. Well, that's not the reason that you're not in touch with the other guys in Journey. It's that you were booted out of the band. And this article is kind of written in a way that makes it seem like, oh, he just left arbitrarily. He wanted to be in Journey, but he just decided, he'd done enough with Journey. So he decided to move on. That's why you have Todd Jensen instead of Ross Valory. I think Ross Valory would probably be still on tour, but here is what I heard at the time is that Ross and Steve were getting tired of touring with Journey, of the stadium routine. They were actually hoping the band would just retire and get off the road, and that would be that. But Neil wanted to keep going, and they didn't. So they thought, hey, if we're going to keep going with this, we want this band to be more like our vision of the band, hence the coup attempt, which failed. The outlet in question here wants to know here, so many people are curious about what went wrong. And Ross Valory says, well, my point is we should talk about what went right. So that's a deflection. They want to know, and it's a good question. So how did we get to the point where a coup attempt was something that you thought was a good idea? how did we get there? And what is it that you don't like about Neil Sean, or at the time, maybe Jonathan Cain, although I think Cain was more on their side at first. And then later on, I think Cain realized that it was going to be very difficult to wrestle control away from Neil Sean. And so Cain decided to throw in again with Neil Sean. And he wants to talk about what's right, mainly because he wants to keep it positive. He doesn't want to tell the details, or he might be gagged. In other words, there may be a gag order as to what the negotiations were and the settlement, the agreement that these guys got. I'm assuming that both Steve Smith and Ross Valory got a lump sum payment to, satisfy whatever it is that those guys were wanting. And it sounded initially like they wanted to take control of the band and then maybe remake the band in their image, which might even include not being in the band. Like, hey, I'll hire the bass player I think should fill in for me. Neil, of course, hired Todd Jensen, and Dean Castronovo came back, which I think, both of those were really good choices. Neil Sean, at times, his leadership when it comes to musicians, I think that's where he's the best, is picking out good musicians. His picks have been good. Like Cain picked Steve Augeri, and Steve did not last very long. And Neil picked Arnell, and Arnell he's still going strong. So kudos to Neil Sean for picking good musicians to fill in. But the story about Ross Valory has to do with kind of like him blocking out the feud that he had with the band and recognizing now that that was drama between, as it says here, passionate musicians with strong convictions. They make it sound like it was a musical disagreement. Nope. It was a financial disagreement, and it was an organizational disagreement. And, it's kind of like when they come back to the band. I think it was the Chicago documentary I watched, and Chris Pinnock was being interviewed, and he said something like, yeah, they come into the room and they say, well, we've decided to go in a different direction. Meaning that you're not part of the new lineup for Chicago. We've decided to go in a different direction, which is just like a corporation, right? Well, we've decided that we no longer need your services. Thank you so much for filling in. And this is how corporatized the music business, at least back in the day. This part of it wasn't what everybody really cared about if you were a fan, but it is interesting to see that these are businesses, and these guys, you have the most popular song in history according to Forbes magazine, and you probably want to wrestle to get control of that franchise. And these guys tried and they failed. So that's kind of the short story here. And Ross doesn't want to talk about it. He just wants to move on. And that's Ross Valory. He's kind of low key. He's kind of a peacemaker, but it's weird because that was way out of character for him and for Steve Smith, for that matter, to try to wrestle control of the brand away from Neil and John. So in any event, folks, Ross Valory out there, not rewriting history, but it's kind of like guilt by omission. Hey, tell us what happened, Ross. That would make a great movie, a great book. See, the whole journey, it's like an epic, right? It's just the early days of Journey, the Steve Perry days, the reluctant Steve Perry phase. Perry leaves, Perry comes back, Perry leaves again. Augeri, Jeff Scott Soto, and then Arnell. And then all of this drama through the years. You got Dean leaving, Dean coming back. You got Steve Smith being told he's not good enough to be in that rhythm section, which is crazy. And then he comes back and then leaves again. So there's definitely a documentary out there that should be written and produced and directed by some high power Hollywood director, because I'm sure it would be a big deal for a lot of fans of this band, and even the casual fans and people who don't care about music. So anyway, Ross Valory, he's the man. Check out his album. Was it The Kitchen Sink? All of the Above. I forget what he called it, but it's like very diverse and eclectic. I think if you use Google, it might assist you, or it might bring you to a place you don't want to go. Because that's kind of what happens to me when I use Google. All right, so here is a never-ending John's Dream one more time, coming back to paradise. This band is from Barcelona, Spain, right? So you don't think of Barcelona as the prog rock capital of the world. That's what makes this so interesting. So check it out when you get a chance. If you don't like it, no big deal. I'm glad you checked it out. All right, folks. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. Also, YouTube memberships, buy me a coffee, and Patreon. If you want to chat over on Patreon, you can join for as little as $1 a month. And you can obviously do $5, whatever your budget allows. And I will be back eventually here. I am kind of getting worried about the hurricane heading this way. But I'll go listen to Lost and Found by the Kinks, and I'll feel a lot better about the whole thing.